Story 1. The Early Years of Mansa Musa, Childhood and Inheritance of Empire. You are about to hear the beginning of a story that is often hidden beneath the glitter of later legends. When people today speak of Mansa Musa, they speak of gold, the emperor who supposedly scattered wealth across the desert on his pilgrimage, the man who is labeled the richest in history. But before there was gold, there was clay. Before there was the reputation of a monarch whose name reached Europe and the Middle East, there was a child growing up in the humid air of West Africa, surrounded by fields of millet and the slow, unchanging rhythm of river life. Musa was born in the latter part of the 13th century, in a Mali that was still settling into its role as one of the great empires of the medieval world. The empire had been founded only decades earlier by Sundiata Keita, a man whose story blurred into legend even while his descendants still ruled. For ordinary people, the name of Sundiata was carried in songs and stories told by griots, the professional storytellers and keepers of memory. For a young boy like Musa, the founder's legacy was not a tale of entertainment, but the reason his own family held authority at all. We do not know the exact details of Musa's childhood. The records left by Arab historians who later wrote about him were more interested in his wealth than in his youth. But what we do know about noble children of Mali in that time allows us to picture his world with some certainty. His earliest days would have been shaped by women. His mother, his attendants, the women of the household who prepared food, washed clothing, and taught him the basic rhythms of speech, behavior, and ritual. The Mali Empire was not a single city but a wide territory stretching across rivers, grasslands, and desert. Its capital, Niamey, lay in the fertile lands near the upper Niger River, where rain was more reliable than in the north. Here Musa's family held land and authority, managing farms and villages that provided food and tribute. As a boy, Musa would not have worked in the fields himself, but he would have been deeply aware of their importance. The steady cultivation of millet, rice, and sorghum was what kept the empire alive. For every story of gold, there were countless mornings of farmers pushing seeds into the soil, countless afternoons of women grinding grain into flour, countless evenings of meals made from the same staples, repeated day after day. A noble boy's education in Mali was not centered on books, for books were rare. Instead, it was shaped by memory. The griots of his household and community would recite genealogies, praise songs, and moral lessons. Through these oral traditions, Musa learned the names of ancestors, the victories and failures of rulers, and the rituals that bound his people together. He would have sat in gatherings where elders spoke slowly and deliberately, repeating phrases until they were fixed in memory. This was a kind of learning that required patience, silence, and respect, qualities that would later serve him as ruler. At the same time, Islam was spreading through the empire. By Musa's youth, it had already reached the court and many towns, carried by merchants and scholars from North Africa. If his family was among the Muslim elite, Musa might have been introduced early to the recitation of the Quran, learning the rhythms of Arabic words even if he did not understand them fully. If his household was slower to adopt Islam, he may instead have grown up with the older religious practices of the region, offerings to spirits, rituals tied to ancestors, the veneration of natural forces. Most likely, he experienced both. The Mali court was not purely Islamic. It blended traditions, allowing rulers to draw legitimacy from both local practices and the faith of the wider Muslim world. Beyond education, Musa's childhood was shaped by survival. West Africa was fertile, but it was not without hardship. Seasonal rains could fail, and with them came the risk of famine. Diseases carried by mosquitoes and water sources were constant threats. Families of nobility were not immune, though they had greater resources to withstand such dangers. Musa would have grown up aware that life was fragile, that fields could wither, that illness could strike suddenly. These realities gave weight to rituals, to the prayers and offerings made in hopes of stability. The physical environment of his early years must also be remembered. Houses in Niamey and other towns were often built of mud brick, their walls smoothed by hand, their surfaces renewed after rains. Roofs of thatch or timber shaded the interiors, keeping the worst of the heat at bay. Streets were not paved with stone but were paths of packed earth, dusty in the dry season and muddy in the rains. Livestock wandered freely. Goats, chickens, and cattle moved through the courtyards. The air was filled with the smoke of cooking fires and the hum of insects. Musa's senses would have been shaped by this world long before he ever encountered the polished courtyards of foreign rulers or the ornate mosques he later sponsored. Politically, the Mali Empire in Musa's youth was stable, but stability did not mean ease. The empire stretched wide, and its rulers depended on networks of loyalty from local chiefs and governors. Tribute was collected not just in gold but in grain, livestock, and labor. Musa would have grown up in a household that both commanded and depended upon others. Peasants who farmed the land, warriors who defended it, traders who brought in salt from the desert. Every meal he ate was a reminder of this structure, for it was the labor of countless people that sustained the nobility. When Musa reached his teenage years, he would have been trained more directly for leadership. This training was less about inspiring speeches and more about patience, listening, and the careful judgment of disputes. A nobleman was expected to resolve conflicts between households, to balance the demands of tribute, to ensure that fields were cultivated and roads kept open. Musa's teachers may have been older male relatives, men who themselves had governed lands and understood the importance of steady, unglamorous administration. The empire's relationship with trade also touched Musa's early life. Caravans crossed the Sahara, bringing salt, cloth, and horses into Mali and carrying out gold, slaves, and ivory. These caravans passed through towns where Musa's family had influence. The sight of camels laden with goods, the arrival of foreign merchants with their strange accents and clothing, would have impressed themselves on his imagination. But again, the reality was less glamorous than later legends. Caravans were slow, weeks or months in the making. Merchants had to bargain, wait, and rest. The trade that sustained the empire was not a river of gold but a trickle of transactions, each requiring patience. It was in this world that Musa learned the slow art of governance. He was not a revolutionary figure in his youth. He did not burst onto the stage with sudden brilliance. Instead, he absorbed the rhythms of his environment, the cadence of griot recitations, the cycles of planting and harvest, the procedures of tribute, the careful balancing of religious practices. These rhythms prepared him not for glory but for endurance. The moment of his rise to power came not through his own ambition but through chance. The king before him, known as Abu Bakr II in some traditions, is said to have embarked on an expedition across the Atlantic Ocean, leaving Musa as his deputy. When that king never returned, Musa was left with the throne. He inherited an empire not because he seized it, but because fate and circumstance demanded it. And so Musa, a man trained in patience in the quiet arts of administration, suddenly found himself seated on the throne of Mali. He was not yet the figure whose name would echo across continents. He was still the child of mud brick houses and millet fields, still a man shaped by stories, rituals, and the careful routines of survival. But the question was no longer whether he could endure these rhythms, it was whether he could command them on a scale larger than he had ever known. Musa's childhood had prepared him for life in a noble household, but had it prepared him for the vast machinery of empire? Could a man raised in routines of patience and tradition guide Mali into a future where desert caravans, river towns, and Islamic scholars all pressed their claims upon the throne? When Musa inherited the throne of Mali, he did not do so through conquest or dramatic upheaval. His rise was quiet, shaped by the absence of another rather than by his own decisive action. The ruler before him had set out on a mysterious voyage, leaving Musa as deputy, and when the voyage ended not in return but in disappearance, the throne passed to him. Thus began a reign that would stretch across decades, not with sudden noise but with a steady and careful rhythm. It is tempting, when hearing this story, to imagine Musa's accession as the beginning of grandeur. But the day-to-day reality of his early rule was not filled with gold or monumental decisions. It was filled with paperwork, or what passed for paperwork in medieval Mali. Lists of tribute, inventories of grain, records of livestock, and oral accounts of who owed what. Governing an empire required patience. To keep power, Musa needed first to maintain stability, and stability rested on boring but vital tasks. The machinery of rule. The Mali Empire in the early 14th century was large, stretching across fertile river valleys, grassy plains, and the edges of the Sahara Desert. Its wealth came not only from gold, though gold is what outsiders noticed most, but from control of trade routes and agriculture. Musa, stepping into the role of Mansa, or king, had to ensure that these sources of wealth kept flowing. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by officials or local rulers who owed loyalty to the Mansa. Their duty was to collect tribute, administer justice, and provide soldiers when needed. Musa's role was to supervise this network, to ensure that no province slipped into rebellion or neglect. This required endless meetings. Messengers arrived from the provinces with reports. Tributes were carried to Niamey, the capital. Disputes were brought to court. Musa listened, considered, and issued judgments. The court of Mali was not a silent chamber but a crowded place filled with attendants, scribes, clerks, and guards. Arab travelers who later described it remarked on its formality and scale, but for Musa in his early years as ruler, it was less a place of ceremony than of constant labor. Every decision he made rippled outward. If he ordered more grain for the capital, peasants in distant villages would feel the burden. If he forgave a debt, the recipient would become loyal, but others might grow jealous. Musa's skill lay in balancing these pressures, in maintaining the delicate web of obligations that held the empire together. The quiet role of religion. Religion, too, was a part of Musa's governance, though not yet the most visible part. Islam had already taken root among the elite of Mali, especially in towns where trade with North Africa was strong. As Mansa, Musa was expected to embody Islamic values, at least in part. This meant supporting mosques, listening to Muslim scholars, and presenting himself as a pious ruler. Yet the empire was not uniformly Islamic. Many of its people still followed older traditions, venerating ancestors, honoring spirits of the land, and practicing rituals tied to the cycles of farming. Musa could not afford to alienate either group. His early reign was marked by a careful balancing act. He allowed Muslim scholars to flourish, but he also respected the traditions of rural communities. When peasants offered sacrifices to ensure good harvests, Musa did not interfere. When traders built mosques in towns, he encouraged them. In this way, he maintained harmony in a diverse empire. His later reputation as a great Muslim king was built gradually, and in these early years it was still taking shape. Daily life in the capital. For those who lived in Niamey, Musa's rule was felt in subtler ways. The capital was not a glittering city of stone but a practical town of mud brick houses, markets, and administrative buildings. Traders brought goods from distant regions: salt from the Sahara, cloth from North Africa, cola nuts from the forests to the south. Markets bustled with activity, their sounds carrying through the streets the cries of vendors, the braying of donkeys, the chatter of buyers. The palace itself, though impressive compared to ordinary houses, was not a palace of marble or gold. It was a large complex of mud brick walls, timber beams, and open courtyards. Within its walls, Musa received officials, judged disputes, and directed the machinery of empire. Guards stood at the entrances, but their weapons were simple: spears, shields, and bows. For all his wealth, Musa's authority depended less on grandeur than on the steady acceptance of his rule. In his daily life, Musa likely rose early, greeted his attendants, and held audiences with officials. Meals would have been simple: millet porridge, rice, meat when available, and milk from cattle. These meals were shared with courtiers and guests, part of the rhythm of hospitality that defined noble life. Musa's evenings may have been filled with recitations from griots, with Quranic readings from scholars, or with the quiet conversations of advisors. His life was busy, but it was not dramatic. It was full of repetition, routine, and the slow work of administration. Trade and the desert. One of Musa's most important responsibilities was overseeing trade. The Mali Empire lay at the heart of trans-Saharan networks, and caravans were constantly moving across its territory. These caravans carried salt, an essential commodity, from the mines of Taghaza in the north, and exchanged it for gold, grain, and slaves in the south. For Musa, ensuring the safety of these caravans was a priority. Banditry or rebellion along the routes could disrupt the entire economy. To secure trade, Musa had to maintain good relations with local chiefs along the caravan paths. He appointed trusted officials to oversee way stations, where caravans could rest and resupply. He levied taxes on goods, ensuring that the empire profited from every exchange. Yet the process was slow and tedious. Merchants complained of delays, officials squabbled over shares, and disputes had to be settled with patience. The wealth that came from trade was not sudden or spectacular. It was the product of countless negotiations, contracts, and routine enforcement. The burden of inheritance. For Musa personally, the burden of rule was heavy. He had not sought the throne, it had come to him. The expectations were immense. The empire was large, its people diverse, its challenges constant. To govern well required not only intelligence but endurance. Musa could not rest on the fame of his predecessor, nor could he indulge in the myths that later generations would build around him. He had to manage the present day by day. And so, in the early years of his reign, Musa's story was not one of dramatic change but of quiet consolidation. He kept the tribute flowing, maintained the loyalty of provinces, balanced religion, and supported trade. He did not yet undertake the grand pilgrimage that would make him famous. He did not yet commission the mosques and universities that would transform Mali's cultural landscape. He was, at this stage, an administrator steady, patient, and cautious. A question of direction. Yet the question lingered, was this enough? Stability was valuable, but stability could also become stagnation. Musa had inherited an empire that was already strong. To maintain it was an achievement, but to expand it, to leave a lasting legacy, required more than patience. It required vision. In the quiet of his court, as he listened to reports of tribute, as he watched caravans arrive and depart, Musa must have wondered. Should he simply maintain what had been given to him, or should he attempt something greater? The Mali Empire under Musa's early reign was stable, patient, and carefully balanced. But stability alone could not satisfy the demands of history. As Musa listened to the whispers of scholars, the ambitions of merchants, and the traditions of griots, a larger idea began to take shape. What would happen when he chose not merely to preserve but to act, to step beyond routine and attempt something bold? In the early years of his reign, Mansa Musa lived in the steady rhythm of administration. He held councils, supervised tribute, managed caravans, and mediated disputes. His empire did not fall into chaos under his watch, nor did it surge forward into unprecedented expansion. Instead, it endured, and endurance was itself a form of strength. Yet history rarely remembers those who simply maintain. To be remembered, Musa needed to step beyond preservation. And slowly, he began to do so. Listening to scholars. At the court of Mali, Musa encountered men whose words carried weight far beyond his own lands. Muslim scholars from North Africa, travelers who crossed the desert not only with goods but with books, and griots who blended ancestral memory with contemporary observation. These men spoke of the wider world, of cities where learning flourished, of empires whose rulers were remembered for their piety, of lands where faith and governance intertwined. To Musa, these conversations were both inspiring and troubling. They offered a vision of greatness measured not merely in gold or tribute, but in culture and religion. At the same time, they reminded him that Mali, for all its wealth, was still a frontier in the eyes of the wider Islamic world. Its scholars were respected, but its name did not yet carry the same prestige as Cairo, Mecca, or Baghdad. The question pressed upon him: should Mali remain a stable empire of trade and fields, or should it strive for a place in the broader stage of history? The pressure of trade. Trade also brought pressure. Caravans carried not only salt and gold but news. Merchants who traveled to North Africa returned with stories of new rulers, shifting alliances, and changes in markets. Musa learned that Mali's wealth was both admired and envied. To protect it, he needed to project authority not just within his borders but beyond them. A ruler who was invisible outside his realm risked being underestimated, and an underestimated empire was vulnerable. The steady flow of goods reminded Musa of Mali's dependence on trade routes that stretched far beyond his control. The Sahara was not his to rule. It was a vast expanse patrolled by Tuareg and Berber groups, whose cooperation was essential for safe passage. To keep trade secure, Musa had to negotiate, to offer incentives, to project strength without provoking unnecessary conflict. These negotiations were delicate and constant, demanding more than mere patience, they demanded vision. Daily life of the empire. While Musa considered these larger questions, the people of Mali continued their lives with the same routines that had shaped them for generations. Farmers rose with the sun, tilled their fields, and prayed for rain. Women carried water from wells, pounded grain into flour, and tended to children. Fishermen cast nets into the Niger, their boats gliding silently through the current. Traders gathered in markets, their voices mixing in a chorus of bargaining and exchange. For these people, the Mansa was a distant figure, a name rather than a presence. His authority reached them through taxes, through judgments, through the occasional arrival of officials or soldiers. Their concerns were local: a good harvest, a healthy child, a fair price at market. And yet their labor sustained Musa's throne. Every grain of millet, every bolt of cloth, every block of salt passed through their hands before it reached the court. In this sense, the empire rested not on Musa's vision, but on the countless, unrecorded efforts of ordinary lives. The turning point of faith. As Musa's reign matured, his interest in Islam grew deeper. This was not unusual. Many rulers of West Africa used Islam as a way to connect their kingdoms to the broader world of trade and scholarship. But for Musa, it became more than a tool of diplomacy. It became a personal conviction, or at least a personal project. He saw in Islam not only a religion but a means of unifying his empire and elevating its status. This realization marked a turning point. Musa began to think beyond the boundaries of his immediate duties. Supporting scholars and building mosques was no longer just a way to please a faction of his court. It became a vision of legacy. He imagined Mali not simply as a kingdom of trade, but as a center of learning and piety, a place that could rival the great cities of the Muslim world. The seeds of the pilgrimage. It was during these reflections that the idea of pilgrimage, the Hajj to Mecca, took root. For a devout Muslim, the pilgrimage was a duty. For a king, it was also an opportunity, a way to display piety, to forge alliances, and to place his empire firmly on the map of the Islamic world. But undertaking such a journey was no small matter. It required planning on a scale that dwarfed ordinary governance. Caravans had to be organized, supplies gathered, routes secured. The journey would take years, and during that time, the empire would need careful management in his absence. In the early stages, Musa did not yet commit to the pilgrimage. But the idea lingered, growing stronger as he listened to scholars and merchants describe the holy cities. It was the kind of ambition that could transform a ruler from caretaker to legend. The weight of history. Even as Musa's vision expanded, the weight of history pressed upon him. He knew that the empire he governed had been built by his ancestors, by the legendary Sundiata Keita, by generations of rulers who had fought, bargained, and endured. To fail would be to dishonor their memory. To succeed would be to extend their legacy. This sense of responsibility was not dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, and constant. It shaped his decisions as much as ambition did. Musa's early reign, then, was not the story of sudden transformation but of gradual awakening. He began as a caretaker, an administrator who inherited power by chance. Slowly, he became a ruler with vision, a man who saw in Islam and trade not only tools of governance but opportunities for greatness. His court remained filled with lists, reports, and disputes, but behind the routines a larger plan was forming. The unanswered question. By the time Musa had fully settled into his role, the empire was stable, prosperous, and respected. Yet the question remained: would stability alone define his reign, or would he dare to step beyond it? Would he remain a patient administrator remembered only by scholars, or would he undertake actions that would echo across centuries? The answer would come in the form of a journey that would stretch across deserts and seas, a pilgrimage that would make his name known from Cairo to Mecca to the courts of Europe. But that was still in the future. For now, Musa stood at the threshold, a ruler shaped by mud-brick towns and millet fields, by griot songs and Quranic recitations, by the slow rhythms of administration and the quiet stirrings of vision. Musa's early years had prepared him for stability, but they had also planted the seeds of ambition. The empire was strong, the trade routes busy, the courts secure. Yet beyond Mali's borders lay a wider world waiting to notice him. How would Musa transform from the quiet caretaker of an empire into the figure who would become a legend of history? Story 2. The architecture of Mali: mud, stone, and silent labor. When you think of the Mali Empire, perhaps you imagine golden caravans crossing the desert, or the legendary wealth of its ruler, Mansa Musa. Yet the empire was also built from something far less glamorous: clay. The cities, palaces, mosques, and homes of Mali were shaped not from marble or bronze but from earth, molded by hand, dried by sun, and renewed each year. This architecture was not designed to astonish travelers with sudden brilliance. It was designed to endure, to blend with the land, to serve the quiet needs of communities. To understand Mali, you must first understand the language of mud. In the Sahel region of West Africa, stone was scarce and wood was precious. The most abundant resource was earth itself, soil mixed with water, reinforced with straw or fibers, shaped into bricks and dried in the open air. From this simple process came the walls of houses, the arches of mosques, and the enclosures of palaces. This was not architecture meant for eternity, like the pyramids of Egypt or the cathedrals of Europe. It was architecture meant for life, for people to inhabit, repair, and renew. The builders of everyday life. The builders of Mali were not famous architects but local craftsmen, often organized by guilds or family traditions. Their knowledge was practical, passed from generation to generation without written manuals. To build a wall, they mixed mud and straw until it reached the right consistency, then pressed it into molds to form bricks. The bricks were laid with more mud serving as mortar, rising row by row until a house or mosque took shape. Roofs were constructed from wooden beams covered with layers of earth, heavy but effective against heat. Every year when the rains returned, these structures demanded repair. The walls softened under the downpour, surfaces eroded, and roofs leaked. But this was not seen as failure. It was part of the cycle. Entire communities gathered for annual maintenance, coating buildings with fresh mud, smoothing walls by hand, singing as they worked. Architecture was not a static achievement but a living process, renewed with the rhythm of the seasons. Niamey, the quiet capital. In Mali's capital, Niamey, the same principles applied. The royal palace was not a fortress of stone but a sprawling complex of mud-brick courtyards, wooden gates, and open spaces. Its grandeur lay not in permanence but in scale. The palace was large, filled with administrative rooms, storerooms, and chambers for audiences. Visitors might have been surprised to find walls of earth rather than stone, but those who lived in Mali understood that the material was practical, abundant, and suited to the climate. Around the palace, ordinary houses filled the town. They were modest structures, often round or rectangular, with walls plastered smooth and roofs of thatch or earth. Families cooked in open courtyards, stored grain in clay silos, and lived their lives within these earthen enclosures. Streets were narrow and unpaved, winding between compounds. Goats and chickens wandered freely. The town was not designed for spectacle but for survival. Mosques and the influence of Islam. If any buildings carried symbolic weight, it was the mosques. With the spread of Islam in Mali, communities built places of worship that combined local materials with new architectural forms. These mosques were still made of mud, but they introduced features inspired by North Africa: rectangular layouts, prayer niches pointing toward Mecca, and towers that rose above the flat skyline. One of the most remarkable examples, though built slightly later in Musa's reign, was the Mosque of Jingreber in Timbuktu. Constructed with mud and supported by timber beams, it became a symbol of Mali's embrace of Islam and scholarship. Its design was simple, practical, and deeply tied to its environment. Each year, the community gathered to replaster its walls, a ritual that continues even today. The mosque stood not because it defied nature, but because it worked with it, accepting that earth must be renewed by human hands. Silent labor. Behind these buildings lay the labor of countless workers, farmers who mixed mud in the dry season, craftsmen who shaped bricks, women who carried water, children who gathered straw. Their work was not recorded in chronicles, but it was their effort that gave Mali its physical form. Unlike gold, which dazzled visitors but passed quickly from hand to hand, mud remained. It enclosed families, protected rulers, and gave shape to worship. The architecture of Mali was humble, and yet it was the stage upon which its history unfolded. It sheltered griots as they recited genealogies, hosted traders as they bargained over salt and gold, and gave rulers a place to hear disputes. The buildings themselves were ordinary, but the lives within them carried the weight of empire. The quiet question: when you picture an empire, do you imagine its walls of clay? Or do you, like so many before, focus only on its treasures? The story of Mali's architecture asks you to look again not at what glittered, but at what endured. For without mud, without silent labor, without the cycle of repair, there could have been no empire at all. The walls of Mali's towns and mosques rose not through sudden brilliance, but through repetition, through the quiet patience of communities working together. But how did these buildings evolve as Musa's reign grew more ambitious? How did architecture shift from simple necessity to a statement of empire? In the first years of Mansa Musa's reign, the architecture of Mali was little different from what it had been for generations. Houses of clay, palaces of mud, mosques supported by timber beams. These structures were practical, suited to the climate and to the materials at hand. Yet as Musa grew in authority, his vision began to extend beyond practicality. He saw in architecture not only shelter but statement. A building could serve as more than a dwelling or a place of worship. It could embody the identity of an empire. The symbol of mosques. Islam gave Musa the language to transform architecture into a form of political expression. For Muslim rulers across the world, the construction of mosques was a declaration of piety and legitimacy. In Cairo, Damascus, and Fez, rulers had commissioned grand places of worship that stood as monuments to their faith and authority. Musa, aware of these traditions through merchants and scholars, began to imagine how Mali might participate in this architectural dialogue. The mosques of Mali did not suddenly change material. They remained built of mud and wood, but their scale and form began to shift. Instead of small community structures, Musa's reign introduced larger, more ambitious mosques. Rectangular in design, oriented toward Mecca, and embellished with timber beams that jutted from their walls, these buildings marked a new stage in Mali's architectural history. They were both local and global, shaped by the earth of the Niger Valley, but informed by the ideas of the wider Islamic world. Timbuktu and Gao. Two cities became focal points for this architectural transformation: Timbuktu and Gao. Timbuktu, once a modest settlement at the edge of the desert, grew under Musa into a center of trade and scholarship. Musa recognized that its importance demanded visible symbols of prestige. The Mosque of Jingreber, built with the guidance of an architect from Andalusia named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, embodied this ambition. The mosque was constructed of mud brick, reinforced with wooden beams that projected outward, serving both as decoration and as scaffolding for annual repairs. Its prayer hall was large, capable of holding hundreds of worshippers, its walls thick and cool against the desert heat. Though humble compared to the stone mosques of Cairo, it carried weight within its environment. It stood as proof that Mali could build not only houses and markets but monuments. Gao, another important city of the empire, also saw architectural investment. Its mosques and markets expanded, shaped by the same blend of local materials and foreign influence. For traders who crossed the desert, these cities offered not only goods but the sight of buildings that testified to the power and piety of the Mali kings. Palaces and administration. Beyond mosques, Musa's reign also expanded the architecture of administration. The royal palace in Niani grew into a larger complex, accommodating the increasing bureaucracy of empire. Here officials managed tribute, stored records, and received envoys. The palace was not built of stone, yet its layout reflected authority. Large courtyards provided space for gatherings, shaded walkways guided officials from chamber to chamber, and storage rooms held the wealth of the empire. To the people who visited, the palace was both familiar and impressive. Its mud walls reminded them of their own houses, yet its scale set it apart. This dual quality reinforced Musa's authority. He was both one of them and above them, rooted in their traditions but elevated by power. Annual renewal as ritual. A striking feature of Mali's architecture was its impermanence. The rains eroded walls, roofs collapsed under water, and surfaces cracked in the dry heat. Buildings required constant renewal, and this renewal became a form of ritual. Each year, entire communities gathered to replaster mosques and houses, smearing fresh mud across their walls. In towns like Timbuktu, this process became a communal event. Men carried mud in baskets, women mixed it with water, children smoothed it onto walls. Songs accompanied the labor, turning repair into celebration. The act of rebuilding was as important as the building itself. In this way, architecture was woven into the rhythm of community life, reminding people that their survival and their monuments depended on collective effort. For Musa, this ritual had political value. It kept communities engaged, reinforced local pride, and maintained the structures that symbolized his authority. The very act of renewal turned his buildings into living monuments never finished, always in process, and always tied to the people. Foreign eyes. When foreign travelers eventually described Mali, they often remarked on its architecture. They did not see marble palaces or stone fortresses, but they did see towns alive with markets, mosques filled with worshippers, and palaces busy with officials. To them, the buildings of mud may have seemed humble, but they also spoke of adaptation, of a people who used what they had to create spaces of governance and faith. The Arab historian al-Umari, writing in Cairo after meeting Musa, recorded stories of Mali's mosques and its architecture of administration. His descriptions confirmed that the empire, though different from North Africa in style, was no less organized. To foreign readers, this was a revelation. Mali was not a land of scattered villages but an empire with cities, markets, and monuments. Architecture as legacy. By the middle of Musa's reign, architecture had become more than necessity. It had become a legacy. The mosques of Timbuktu, the palace of Niani, the markets of Gao all stood as reminders of a ruler who invested not only in gold but in buildings. These structures did not glitter, but they endured, renewed each year by the hands of ordinary people. And yet, for all their significance, they raised a question. Could buildings of mud truly embody the grandeur of empire? Could walls that dissolved in rain ever match the stone monuments of other civilizations? Or was Mali's architecture destined always to be overlooked, its significance hidden beneath the more dramatic stories of wealth and pilgrimage? Musa had begun to use architecture as a statement of power, linking his empire to the wider Islamic world while remaining rooted in the earth of West Africa. But the cycle of mud and rain meant that even his grandest mosques required constant repair. What did it mean for an empire's legacy to depend on walls that could crumble in a single season? When you think of legacy, perhaps you imagine monuments of stone, the pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Greece, the cathedrals of Europe. These structures stand unchanged for centuries, weathering storms and bearing witness to generations. Mali's architecture was different. It did not strive for permanence. It was made of earth, and it accepted decay as part of its cycle. And yet, in this acceptance lay its true legacy. Mud as memory. Each year, the people of Mali renewed their buildings. They carried mud in baskets, mixed it with straw, smoothed it across walls, and left it to dry in the sun. In doing so, they participated in a ritual that bound communities together. Every wall bore the marks of many hands. Every mosque was shaped not only by rulers but by ordinary laborers. The memory of Mali's architecture was not in unchanging stone, but in the repetition of touch, in the rhythm of repair, in the act of rebuilding again and again. For Mansa Musa, this cycle served as a reminder of the nature of power. His grand mosques and palaces were not eternal. They required the effort of his people to endure. His authority, like his buildings, rested on constant renewal. Tribute had to be collected each year, justice administered each day, alliances maintained in every season. Architecture reflected governance. Both were living processes, fragile if neglected, strong if sustained. Timbuktu's reputation. The most famous architectural legacy of Musa's reign was Timbuktu. The city's mosques and libraries became symbols of Mali's intellectual life. Foreign travelers who visited in later centuries described its buildings with a mixture of respect and curiosity. They did not marvel at stone carvings or soaring spires, but they noted the scale of its markets, the density of its streets, the presence of scholars teaching within mud-brick halls. Timbuktu's reputation grew not from the material of its architecture but from its function. The buildings housed scholars, protected manuscripts, and provided space for worship. Their walls were humble, but the ideas within them were vast. The city's architecture became a vessel for knowledge, its value measured not in durability but in the wisdom it sheltered. The question of permanence. Still, the fragility of Mali's buildings could not be ignored. Rains washed away surfaces, termites gnawed at timber, and walls collapsed when neglected. Many structures from Musa's time have not survived, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct their forms from fragments and oral accounts. This raises a question. Can an empire be remembered through architecture that does not last? The answer lies in how memory works. Stone endures in silence, but mud endures through renewal. The survival of Mali's architecture depended not on the stubbornness of material, but on the persistence of people. As long as communities gathered each year to replaster walls, the buildings lived. Their legacy was not in frozen permanence but in continuity of practice. Architecture and empire. In this way, Mali's architecture mirrored the empire itself. The empire was not fixed. It expanded, contracted, and adapted. It depended on trade, on negotiations, on the labor of countless communities. Like its buildings, it required constant renewal. Tribute had to be gathered, alliances reforged, caravans protected. Just as a mosque fell into ruin if neglected, so too could the empire weaken if governance faltered. Musa understood this parallel. His investment in architecture was not a quest for immortality in stone, but a recognition of the rhythms of his world. By building mosques, markets, and palaces, he gave his people spaces to gather, to pray, to trade, to govern. These spaces, renewed each year, kept the empire alive. The echo in modern times. Even today, Mali's earthen architecture continues this legacy. The great mosque of Djenné, though reconstructed in later centuries, still stands as a testament to this tradition. Each year, the people of the city gather to replaster its walls, carrying mud, singing, and working together. The ritual is more than maintenance. It is memory, a connection to centuries of history. In this way, Mali's architecture reminds us that permanence is not the only path to legacy. Renewal, repetition, and community can also preserve memory across time. The mud walls of Mali may not stand untouched for 1,000 years, but they continue to rise and fall, shaped by the same hands that once shaped the empire. A final reflection. When you imagine Mansa Musa, do not think only of gold scattered in foreign markets. Think also of clay pressed into bricks, of hands smoothing mud across walls, of children carrying water to mix with straw. Think of mosques that needed annual repair, palaces that rose from earth only to be renewed again. This was the true architecture of Mali, humble, fragile, and yet enduring through community. The walls of Mali did not last forever, but the rituals that built and rebuilt them carried the empire's memory across centuries. If gold made Musa famous, it was mud that made Mali live. And so the question remains, when we measure the greatness of a civilization, should we look only at what endures in stone, or should we also consider the fragile walls that must be rebuilt each year, sustained by the hands of ordinary people? Story 3. Caravans and Salt. Trade beyond the glitter of gold. When people tell the story of the Mali Empire, they often begin with gold. Gold dazzled foreign visitors, filled the imaginations of European mapmakers, and shaped the legends of Mansa Musa's wealth. Yet within the empire itself, another substance was equally, if not more, essential. That substance was salt. Salt was the quiet foundation of Mali's prosperity. Without it, food could not be preserved, bodies weakened, and trade faltered. Salt was not glamorous, but it was necessary. Its value lay not in glitter, but in survival. To understand the empire's greatness, you must look beyond the shimmer of gold to the steady weight of salt carried across the desert. The geography of necessity. West Africa, with its fertile river valleys and abundant crops, had many resources but lacked natural deposits of salt in its southern regions. Salt was vital in hot climates, where sweat carried it away and diets needed it replaced. Without enough salt, muscles cramped, energy faltered, and health declined. For farmers, herders, and traders alike, salt was not a luxury but a necessity. In the far north, at the edge of the Sahara, lay the great salt mines, Tagheza, Taoudeni, and others. Here, workers carved blocks of salt from the desert floor, shaping them into slabs that could be stacked onto camels. These mines were harsh places. The air was dry, the sun relentless, and the work backbreaking. The miners lived in conditions so barren that they often built their houses from blocks of salt itself. Yet their labor sustained empires. The caravans of the Sahara. From these mines, salt traveled south in great caravans. Imagine hundreds of camels stretched across the desert, each carrying heavy slabs of salt, their padded feet pressing into the sand with slow, steady rhythm. The caravans were led by experienced guides who knew the routes, the wells, and the dangers. To cross the Sahara required patience and endurance. Journeys took weeks, sometimes months. Caravans moved by night to escape the heat, resting by day in whatever shade they could find. Merchants sang to keep pace, recited prayers to maintain courage, and relied on each other for survival. Along the way, they faced sandstorms, bandits, and the constant threat of thirst. Many perished, but the caravans continued, for the value of salt made the risks worthwhile. Markets of exchange. When the caravans reached towns on the edge of Mali, the slabs of salt entered markets where they were exchanged for gold, grain, and slaves. Towns like Timbuktu, Gao, and Walata became hubs of this trade. The markets were busy places, filled with the cries of vendors, the smells of spices, the lowing of cattle, and the clatter of goods being weighed and measured. In these markets, salt was treated almost like currency. Its value was measured carefully, negotiated fiercely. Sometimes a slab of salt could be worth its weight in gold, depending on supply and demand. Traders from the south brought gold and kola nuts. Traders from the north brought salt, cloth, and horses. The exchanges bound together distant worlds, linking the savannas of West Africa with the Mediterranean coasts of North Africa. Daily life and salt. For ordinary people in Mali, salt shaped daily life in quiet ways. It flavored meals of millet and rice, preserved meat for storage, and provided nutrients that kept bodies strong. Without salt, food spoiled quickly, making survival during lean seasons far more difficult. Families stored salt carefully, breaking off small pieces to grind into cooking pots. A household's wealth was sometimes measured not in gold but in its stock of salt. Salt also played a role in rituals. Some communities used it in offerings, seeing it as a substance that carried purity and strength. Traders sometimes swore oaths upon slabs of salt, treating it as a sacred commodity. Its presence was woven not only into the economy but into the culture. The shadow of gold. And yet, despite its importance, salt rarely captured the imagination of outsiders. Visitors from afar saw Mali's gold and wrote of its abundance, its brightness, its power. Salt seemed dull by comparison, but those who lived within the empire knew differently. Gold enriched kings, salt sustained people. Gold traveled to distant lands, salt fed households each day. The unasked question. So when you picture the caravans of Mali, do not think only of glittering treasure. Think also of the slow march of camels burdened with heavy slabs, of miners carving in silence beneath the desert sun, of families breaking crystals into their food. For in the end, the empire rested not on the shimmer of gold but on the quiet weight of salt. The caravans carried salt across deserts and into markets, but how did this trade shape the empire's politics and diplomacy? How did the rulers of Mali ensure that the lifeblood of salt kept flowing? And what did it mean for the balance of power within and beyond their borders? Salt was more than food. In the Mali Empire, it was power. Whoever controlled the movement of salt controlled the arteries of trade, the flow of wealth, and the daily survival of communities. Mansa Musa and the rulers before him understood this reality. Their empire's strength depended not only on armies or tribute, but on the careful governance of salt. Taxation and tribute. The first way in which salt shaped politics was through taxation. As caravans crossed Mali's territory, officials stationed along the routes collected tolls. Each slab of salt was accounted for, and merchants paid fees for safe passage. In some cases, the empire took a portion of the goods themselves, adding slabs of salt to royal stores. These taxes filled the treasury, funding the court, the army, and the construction of mosques and palaces. Tribute from conquered regions also included salt. Local chiefs and governors were expected to provide not only grain and livestock, but also slabs of salt. These payments bound provinces to the empire and reminded them of their dependence on the Mansa's authority. For the ruler, tribute was a visible measure of loyalty. For the people, it was a heavy burden, but one that sustained the empire's stability. Control of mines. Though the great mines lay on the fringes of the empire, control over them was essential. Tagheza, one of the most important mines, was worked by slaves under harsh conditions. The laborers lived in salt block houses, their lives consumed by extraction. The mine was dangerous, the environment unforgiving, and yet the slabs it produced were worth the suffering. Mali did not directly administer every mine, but it ensured that their output flowed through its territory. Alliances with desert tribes, patrols of caravan routes, and the placement of officials allowed the empire to keep a firm grip on supply. If rival groups attempted to divert salt caravans, Mali's armies intervened. The empire's power extended across the sands not by permanent garrisons, but by influence and force when necessary. Diplomacy across the desert. Salt also shaped Mali's diplomacy with North Africa. The rulers of Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt depended on gold from Mali, but they also valued its salt. Caravans created bonds of interdependence. Envoys traveled between courts, carrying gifts and negotiating terms of trade. For Musa, maintaining these relationships was as important as defending borders. Diplomacy was often quiet work. Letters written in Arabic by scribes, gifts exchanged, promises made. A slab of salt might not seem like a diplomatic tool, but when multiplied into hundreds or thousands, it became a matter of state. To disrupt the flow of salt was to risk not only economic loss but political tension with distant allies and trading partners. The burden of protection. Protecting salt routes required organization. Caravans were vulnerable to bandits, to raiding tribes, to the dangers of the desert itself. The empire deployed soldiers to key points, especially near wells and crossings. These soldiers were not always fighting battles. Often their duty was simply to stand guard, to ensure that merchants felt safe enough to travel. Yet the burden was heavy. The Sahara was vast, and no empire could patrol every stretch. Instead, Mali relied on alliances with desert peoples, offering them rewards for guiding caravans and punishing bandits. This system of shared responsibility extended the empire's reach without exhausting its resources, but it also required constant vigilance. A neglected alliance could lead to attacks. A lapse in protection could disrupt the flow of trade. Internal power and salt. Within the empire, salt influenced politics at court. Governors of key towns controlled markets where salt was exchanged, and their authority gave them leverage. Ambitious officials could use salt revenues to build local power, making them both valuable and potentially threatening to the Mansa. To keep balance, Musa rotated officials, demanded reports, and sometimes imposed harsh penalties for corruption. Salt also shaped succession. A ruler who failed to protect trade risked losing legitimacy. Griots recorded not only the bravery of kings, but also their ability to maintain prosperity. To neglect salt was to neglect the lifeblood of the empire, and history was not kind to rulers who allowed the caravans to falter. The symbol of authority. In Musa's reign, salt became a symbol of authority. Royal stores contained slabs of salt alongside gold, demonstrating the empire's dual wealth. When Musa hosted visitors, he could display not only treasures of gold but also the necessities of salt. This balance showed his power in both survival and splendor. Salt slabs themselves were sometimes used as gifts, presented to envoys or exchanged in rituals. To give salt was to give life, and the gesture carried meaning beyond its material value. In this way, salt reinforced the Mansa's role as both provider and protector. A fragile balance. For all its importance, salt trade was fragile. A drought could dry wells, a raid could scatter caravans, a corrupt official could disrupt markets. The system required constant attention, endless adjustment. Musa's genius was not in creating salt trade that had existed before him, but in maintaining and strengthening it. His reign kept the routes secure, the markets supplied, and the empire's reputation intact. But fragility remained. Behind the glitter of wealth lay the unspoken truth. If the caravan stopped, if the slabs did not arrive, the empire itself would weaken. The politics of salt shaped the Mali Empire's power, binding together miners, merchants, governors, and rulers in a web of necessity. But what of the human stories behind this trade, the lives of those who marched in caravans, who mined in silence, who bargained in markets? How did ordinary people experience the weight of salt that sustained an empire? Salt may have carried empires on its back, but its true weight was borne by people. Behind the ledgers of tribute, the slabs stacked in markets, and the revenues that filled royal treasuries lay countless human lives. Miners, caravan drivers, merchants, and households all felt the presence of salt in their daily existence. To tell the story of Mali's salt trade is not only to speak of politics, but to notice the quiet endurance of these lives. The miners of Tagheza. At the mines of Tagheza, life was harsh. The desert stretched in every direction, barren and dry. Workers lived in huts built not from clay or wood but from blocks of salt, for there was little else. Each day they cut into the earth with crude tools, prying loose slabs of crystalline salt, lifting them into the sunlight. Their hands were cracked, their bodies worn, their lungs filled with dust. Most of these miners were enslaved. They had been captured in wars or raids or sold into bondage through debt. Their labor was relentless, their lives short. Few left the mines, most perished in the desert, their bones joining the sands they had worked. And yet their labor sustained the empire. Without their sweat and suffering, no caravans would have departed, no markets filled, no kings enriched. The caravan drivers. From the mines, salt passed to caravan drivers. These men were often free, though their lives were scarcely less demanding. They led camels in long lines across the desert, guiding them from well to well, through scorching days and frigid nights. A caravan might contain hundreds of animals, each laden with slabs of salt. The drivers walked beside them, calling out chants to keep the rhythm, sharing sparse food and water. Caravan life was a test of patience. Sandstorms could erase the path, forcing guides to rely on memory of stars and landmarks. Thirst pressed constantly, for water was never enough. Bandits lurked in the shadows of dunes, ready to attack when guards grew weary. Yet the drivers endured, for the rewards at journey's end meant survival for their families. The merchants of the markets. In towns like Timbuktu, Gao, and Walata, merchants took their turn in the cycle of salt. They received slabs from caravans, bargained fiercely over their value, and exchanged them for gold, grain, and other goods. Their skill lay not in brute strength but in calculation, knowing when to sell, when to store, and when to trade. Markets were noisy, crowded places. Salt slabs lay stacked beside heaps of kola nuts, rolls of cloth, jars of oil, and cages of birds. Traders argued, children ran between stalls, animals brayed. The air was thick with dust and voices. To the merchants, each slab of salt was more than a mineral. It was a measure of wealth, a tool of exchange, a bridge between distant worlds. Salt in the home. For households, salt appeared in quiet, everyday ways. Women ground small pieces into cooking pots, flavoring porridge of millet or rice. Families stored slabs carefully, guarding them against theft. Salt preserved fish pulled from the Niger, meat butchered after a hunt, butter churned from cattle. Without it, food spoiled quickly, and families risked hunger in the dry season. Children grew up knowing the value of salt. They saw their parents trade it for cloth or cattle, felt its sharp taste on their tongues, and learned to treat it with respect. A household's ability to store salt was often as important as owning land or animals. It was the invisible wealth that sustained life. The overlooked lives. The chronicles of history rarely mention miners, drivers, or housewives. They focus instead on kings, scholars, and generals. Yet the empire depended on these overlooked lives. The miners of Tagheza, laboring until their bodies broke, provided the raw material. The caravan drivers, patient in the desert, carried it across the sands. The merchants, shrewd in the markets, turned it into profit. The families, grinding it into food, transformed it into survival. Mansa Musa's fame rested on gold, but his reign depended on salt. Without the work of these countless people, his empire would have weakened, his wealth diminished, his pilgrimage impossible. Salt was the quiet thread binding the empire together, and the people who carried it were its true foundation. The fragile legacy. Over time, the salt trade continued, long after Musa's reign ended. Caravans still crossed the Sahara, merchants still bargained in Timbuktu, families still stored slabs in their homes. The empire itself eventually declined, but the trade endured. Even today, in parts of Mali and Mauritania, salt caravans still move across the desert, their camels loaded with heavy slabs, their drivers chanting as they march. The legacy of Mali's salt trade is not in monuments or legends, but in continuity. It is in the survival of practices, the persistence of markets, the endurance of people who walk the same routes their ancestors once walked. The glitter of gold fades in memory, but the quiet necessity of salt remains. The story of Mali's caravans was not only the story of wealth but of survival. Salt shaped empires, but more importantly, it shaped lives of hardship, endurance, and quiet strength. And so one must ask, when we think of greatness, should we measure it by the brilliance of kings, or by the unseen labor of those who carried salt across the desert, sustaining an empire one slab at a time? Story 4. The Silent Scholars of Timbuktu, Knowledge as Currency. When people imagine Timbuktu, they often think of a mythical city of gold, hidden in the sands of the Sahara, unreachable and mysterious. For centuries, European explorers dreamed of finding it, believing it to be a place of treasure. But within Mali's empire, Timbuktu's true wealth was not gold. It was knowledge. The scholars of Timbuktu lived in mud brick houses, studied in simple courtyards, and taught in modest mosques. They owned no glittering thrones, built no towering monuments. Their wealth was made of paper, ink, and memory. In the 15th century, long after Mansa Musa's pilgrimage had made the city famous, Timbuktu became a center for learning. But its roots as a place of scholarship stretched back earlier, to Musa's own reign, when books began to matter as much as gold, and when men who spoke softly shaped the empire with words. The arrival of books. Books in West Africa were rare, precious objects. They traveled across the desert in the same caravans that carried salt and gold. Packed carefully in leather, they were brought by merchants from North Africa, from Cairo, Fez, and beyond. These books contained religious texts, histories, works of law, poetry, medicine, and mathematics. When they arrived in Timbuktu, they were treated with reverence. To own a book was to possess status, for books were more than objects, they were currency. They could be traded, lent, or inherited. Families built collections, some modest, some vast. Scholars copied them by hand, writing with reed pens on imported paper, their ink made from local plants and minerals. The slow scratch of pen across page filled the courtyards of Timbuktu, a sound as steady as the chanting of prayers. The scholars' world. The scholars themselves were men of quiet discipline. They rose early, prayed, and then gathered with their students in shaded courtyards or the cool interiors of mosques. Lessons were spoken aloud, repeated until memorized. Students sat in circles, listening intently, their voices echoing as they recited verses or argued points of law. Subjects ranged from the Quran and Islamic law to astronomy, grammar, and history. Some scholars specialized in practical knowledge, how to calculate inheritance shares, how to judge disputes, how to navigate by stars. Others devoted themselves to philosophy or poetry. All treated knowledge as something living, passed from teacher to student, preserved not for spectacle but for use. In this way, Timbuktu became a city of quiet pages. Its scholars shaped the rhythm of daily life as much as merchants or rulers. Their work did not dazzle visitors like the gold-laden caravans, but it sustained the empire in a different way by giving it intellectual foundations, by connecting it to the wider Muslim world. Mosques as classrooms. The architecture of Timbuktu reflected this scholarly life. Mosques doubled as schools, their walls of mud enclosing both worship and learning. The Jingreber Mosque, built during Musa's reign, became one of the most important centers. Students gathered in its halls, sitting on mats, their voices rising in recitation. Smaller mosques across the city served the same purpose, turning every neighborhood into a potential classroom. Learning was not confined to buildings. Scholars often taught in their own homes, opening their courtyards to students. A family house could become a center of learning, its walls lined with manuscripts, its benches crowded with young men eager to study. In this way, scholarship wove itself into the fabric of daily life, inseparable from the rhythms of family and community. Knowledge as status. In Timbuktu, status did not come only from wealth or lineage. It also came from knowledge. A scholar with a large collection of books commanded respect equal to that of a wealthy merchant. Families sought to marry into scholarly households, valuing education as much as riches. Manuscripts were passed down like treasures, sometimes worth more than gold. Knowledge shaped politics too. Rulers sought the advice of scholars, especially in matters of law and religion. A king could display power through armies and tribute, but he also needed the legitimacy that came from the blessing of scholars. Musa himself relied on learned men to guide his policies, blending political authority with intellectual counsel. The rhythm of study. The life of a scholar was not dramatic. It was a life of repetition and patience. Day after day, lessons were recited, texts copied, questions debated. The rhythm was steady, almost monotonous, and yet it was through this monotony that learning accumulated. Manuscripts grew, students matured into teachers, traditions solidified. Knowledge expanded not through sudden discovery but through the slow layering of centuries. This rhythm, though quiet, shaped an empire. It ensured that Mali was not only a land of trade but also a land of thought. It connected Timbuktu to the wider Islamic world, giving it prestige beyond its borders. And it left behind a legacy of manuscripts that, though fragile, outlived even the empire itself. The scholars of Timbuktu turned mud brick houses into classrooms and paper into treasure. But how did their quiet authority shape the empire's politics and daily life? What role did they play in guiding kings, resolving disputes, and linking Mali to the intellectual traditions of the wider world? Knowledge in Timbuktu was not a private pursuit. It was woven into the fabric of politics, law, and community. While kings ruled with armies and governors administered provinces, scholars shaped the moral and intellectual framework of the empire. Their influence was subtle, rarely dramatic, but it reached deep into the daily workings of Mali. Scholars and kings. Mansa Musa, like rulers before and after him, understood the value of scholars. A king's authority in an Islamic world required more than wealth or force. It required legitimacy. Scholars provided that legitimacy. By endorsing a ruler's policies, by issuing legal opinions in his favor, by presenting him as a pious Muslim, they strengthened his hold on power. Audiences with scholars were often as important as meetings with generals. Musa listened to their advice on matters of law, taxation, and ritual. When he planned his pilgrimage to Mecca, it was scholars who guided him on the obligations of Hajj, the logistics of prayer, and the symbolism of generosity. Their counsel gave his actions weight, transforming them from personal choices into acts of religious and political meaning. Law and disputes. The authority of scholars extended into the realm of law. Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh, had been adopted in Mali's towns, providing a framework for contracts, marriages, inheritances, and disputes. Scholars served as judges, applying these laws to everyday conflicts. Imagine a dispute in Timbuktu between two merchants. One claims that a debt has not been repaid, the other insists it has. The case is brought before a scholar. He listens carefully, hears witnesses, consults written contracts if they exist, and issues a ruling based on Islamic law. His decision is respected, for it carries both religious and social authority. In this way, scholars maintained order, resolving conflicts without violence, ensuring that trade could flourish in trust. But their role was not limited to urban centers. In rural areas, scholars traveled to villages, teaching, arbitrating disputes, and offering guidance. Their presence linked distant communities to the broader structure of the empire, weaving law into daily life across vast territories. Knowledge and diplomacy. Scholars also served as intermediaries in diplomacy. Their fluency in Arabic connected Mali to the wider Islamic world. Letters exchanged between Musa and rulers in Cairo or Morocco were often written by scholars, their words carefully chosen to convey respect and authority. When foreign envoys visited Mali, scholars acted as interpreters and hosts, explaining the empire's customs and laws. They demonstrated that Mali was not a land of ignorance but one of learning, capable of conversing on equal terms with the intellectual centers of the Muslim world. Through their words, Mali's reputation grew. Teaching as power. The classrooms of Timbuktu were also places of power. By training students, scholars shaped future judges, administrators, and advisors. A ruler might appoint a trusted student of a prominent scholar to an official post, knowing that his education guaranteed loyalty to both the law and the faith. Teaching created networks of influence. Students remained tied to their teachers even after they advanced, carrying their reputations into new towns and courts. A scholar who taught many students gained authority beyond his own household. His voice echoed in decisions made across the empire. This quiet network strengthened the role of scholarship in governance. Knowledge in the marketplace. Even markets felt the presence of scholars. They issued rulings on fair weights and measures, on contracts between merchants, on disputes over property. Their presence gave confidence to trade, ensuring that buyers and sellers trusted the rules that governed exchange. Without this framework, commerce would have been far riskier, disputes far bloodier. In this way, knowledge itself became a kind of currency. Merchants relied on scholars as much as they relied on caravans. A ruling from a respected judge could secure a fortune. A judgment against a dishonest trader could ruin him. The silent authority of scholars made markets function as smoothly as the flow of gold and salt. The balance of power. Yet scholars did not always agree with rulers. At times, they criticized policies, denounced corruption, or resisted excess. Their authority was moral rather than military, but it carried weight. A ruler who ignored scholars risked losing legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects. A king could command armies, but he could not command respect without the blessing of knowledge. This balance created tension. Musa, though powerful, knew that his reputation as a pious Muslim mattered. He gave generously to scholars, supported mosques, and sponsored learning not only out of faith, but also out of necessity. His greatness was measured as much in his patronage of knowledge as in his wealth. The quiet influence. The influence of Timbuktu's scholars was not loud or sudden. It was quiet, gradual, and constant. Through rulings, teachings, and advice, they shaped the moral compass of the empire. Their authority extended into markets, courts, palaces, and villages. They were not generals, but they commanded loyalty. They were not kings, but they shaped kingship. The scholars of Timbuktu carried no swords, commanded no armies, and built no fortresses. Yet their authority reached into every corner of the empire. But what became of their legacy beyond Musa's reign? How did their manuscripts, their students, and their quiet influence shape Mali long after the empire began to decline? The Mali Empire eventually weakened. Its borders shrank, its provinces rebelled, and rival powers rose. Armies that had once marched under the banners of its kings scattered, and the grandeur of its rulers faded. Yet in Timbuktu, something quieter endured. The scholars who had once advised kings and judged disputes left behind manuscripts, fragile, handwritten books that carried their voices beyond the fall of the empire. The manuscript libraries. Across Timbuktu, families preserved collections of manuscripts. These were not state archives or royal treasuries, but private libraries passed down from father to son, from teacher to student. In mud brick houses, manuscripts were wrapped in leather, stored in wooden chests, and hidden from harm. The subjects of these works were varied. Qurans copied with care, treatises on law, guides to medicine, texts on astronomy, histories of rulers, and collections of poetry. Each book bore the marks of its scribe, careful calligraphy, notes in the margins, sometimes even prayers for the reader. They were not mass-produced. Each one was the labor of hours, days, or weeks. Over centuries, these manuscripts accumulated, forming one of the richest collections of knowledge in Africa. Timbuktu's libraries became famous, though their fame grew slowly, carried not by armies but by memory. Students and teachers. Even as political power shifted, the rhythm of scholarship continued. Teachers gathered students in courtyards, reciting texts, debating points of law, and copying manuscripts. The fall of rulers did not end this work. Knowledge was not bound to thrones. It was bound to memory, to the relationship between teacher and student. A student who learned from a master in Timbuktu might travel to another town, carrying a manuscript with him, spreading knowledge like seeds scattered across soil. In this way, the scholarly traditions of Timbuktu extended beyond the empire itself, weaving Mali into the intellectual fabric of the wider Islamic world long after its political strength faded. The quiet survival. In later centuries, Timbuktu faced invasions, occupations, and neglect. Armies came and went, rulers rose and fell, but families continued to guard their manuscripts. Some buried them in the sand to protect them from looting. Others hid them in walls or carried them away when fleeing. This quiet survival was itself a form of resistance. While fortresses crumbled and palaces decayed, manuscripts endured because people valued them. They were not monuments of stone, but living texts renewed by each reader, each copyist, each teacher. Knowledge beyond empire. What made Timbuktu's scholarship remarkable was not only its endurance but its reach. Through manuscripts, Mali connected itself to a wider world. Texts from Cairo, Baghdad, and Andalusia mingled with local works, creating a blend of ideas unique to West Africa. Scholars debated astronomy while living under the desert sky, studied medicine while treating fevers and wounds, and wrote histories that placed Mali within the story of Islam. In this way, Timbuktu was never isolated. It was part of a vast intellectual network, a node in the exchange of ideas as important as any caravan route. Gold may have carried Mali's name to distant lands, but it was manuscripts that carried its mind. The legacy today. Centuries later, Timbuktu's manuscripts still exist, though many remain hidden in family collections, fragile and at risk. Efforts to preserve them continue, recognizing their value not only for Mali but for the world. They are reminders that Africa's history is not only one of kingdoms and battles, but also of thought, study, and quiet scholarship. The scholars of Timbuktu may not have built monuments of stone, but they left behind monuments of words. Their legacy is written not in towers but in pages, not in gold but in ink. A reflection on wealth. When we speak of wealth, we often think of material treasure, gold, salt, land. But Timbuktu shows another kind of wealth, the wealth of knowledge. Manuscripts that guided judges, taught students, and preserved memory were riches that outlasted empires. They did not glitter, but they endured. The empire of Mali declined, but the voices of Timbuktu's scholars remained, whispering from fragile pages carried across generations. If gold made Mali famous, it was knowledge that made it wise. And so we may ask, which truly measures the greatness of a civilization, its treasures of earth or its treasures of thought? Story 5. Daily life in Niani. How the capital breathed and slept. When we imagine a capital city, we often think of stone palaces, paved streets, and monuments meant to impress. Niani, the capital of the Mali Empire, was different. It was not a city of marble but of earth. Its walls were mud brick, its streets were dusty, its palaces sprawled rather than towered. Yet it was here, in this modest place, that the empire breathed and governed. Niani was not a place of spectacle. It was a place of rhythm. Each day unfolded with quiet repetition, the markets opening with the rising sun, the sound of pounding grain in courtyards, the calls of traders at their stalls, the steady recitation of prayers in the mosque. To understand the Mali Empire, one must walk through Niani not as a visitor searching for grandeur, but as a resident living among its routines. The setting of Niani. Niani lay near the upper Niger River, in a fertile region that offered water, farmland, and connections to trade routes. The river provided fish, irrigated fields, and served as a path for boats carrying goods. Surrounding the city, fields of millet, sorghum, and rice stretched outward, tended by farmers whose work sustained the capital's population. The city itself was built of compounds, enclosed courtyards with mud brick houses clustered together. Families lived within these compounds, cooking in the open, storing grain in clay silos and tending small gardens. Streets wound irregularly, narrow and unpaved, shaped more by habit than by planning. Goats and chickens wandered freely, their bleating and clucking mingling with the voices of people. At its center lay the royal palace. Unlike stone fortresses in Europe or Asia, the palace of Naini was built of earth. It was large rather than tall, composed of courtyards, halls, and chambers. Its walls were smoothed with mud plaster, its gates reinforced with timber. Within its enclosures, the Mansa and his officials managed the affairs of empire. Markets and trade. Naini's heart beat strongest in its markets. Each morning, vendors carried their goods into the city, baskets of grain, bundles of firewood, jars of oil, slabs of salt, and coils of rope. Traders from distant lands added variety, cloth from the north, beads from across the desert, and sometimes even books. The market was noisy, filled with the calls of sellers and the bargaining of buyers. Women often dominated the stalls, selling food and household goods, while men traded in livestock or larger commodities. Children darted between the crowds, carrying small items or simply watching the bustle. Prices shifted with supply and demand. After a good harvest, grain might be cheap. After a drought, it grew expensive. Salt brought by caravan could be worth as much as gold, depending on the season. These fluctuations shaped not only the market but the mood of the city, for everyone depended on trade to survive. Daily work. The rhythm of life in Naini was shaped by work. Farmers rose early to tend fields, often walking from villages outside the city walls. Craftsmen labored in workshops, blacksmiths forging tools, potters shaping clay, weavers producing cloth. Griots, the storytellers and historians, rehearsed genealogies and prepared for ceremonies. Work was not confined to men. Women ground grain, brewed beer, wove textiles, sold goods in markets, and managed households. Their labor sustained families, and their presence in trade gave them a vital role in the city's economy. Children worked too, often alongside their parents. A boy might learn blacksmithing from his father, while a girl learned weaving from her mother. Work was not only survival but also education, passing down skills and traditions across generations. Religion and ritual. Prayer punctuated daily life. The call to prayer echoed through the city, summoning Muslims to mosques or courtyards. Not everyone in Naini followed Islam strictly, but its presence was strong, shaping the city's rhythm. Festivals brought processions, prayers, and feasts, filling the streets with celebration. Traditional beliefs also lingered, blending with Islam in subtle ways. Rituals for fertility, harvest, or protection were carried out quietly, often within families. The city was a place where multiple traditions coexisted, reflecting the diversity of its people. Night in the capital. When the sun set, Naini changed. The market quieted, workshops closed, and families gathered in courtyards for evening meals. Fires glowed, cooking pots bubbled, and conversations drifted into the night air. Griots sometimes performed, their voices carrying stories of ancestors and kings, their music weaving history into entertainment. The palace remained active after dark, for rulers often held audiences in the cooler hours. Courtiers and visitors waited in torchlit courtyards, their shadows flickering against mud-brick walls. Decisions about tribute, disputes, and appointments were made under the stars as much as under the sun. Eventually, the city fell into sleep. Dogs barked in the distance, crickets sang, and the quiet of night wrapped Naini. Even in rest, the capital breathed, ready to wake and repeat its rhythm once more. Naini's daily life was not dazzling, but it was steady, practical, and essential. Yet behind the rhythms of farming, markets, and prayer lay the machinery of governance. How did the palace organize the empire's wealth and manage its people? What structures of administration turned the quiet capital into the beating heart of one of the largest empires in Africa? Naini was not only a city of markets and families. It was the administrative heart of the Mali Empire, where decisions rippled outward to villages, provinces, and distant trade routes. To walk through its palace was to step into the machinery of governance, a system of scribes, officials, and courtiers who turned the authority of the Mansa into practical order. The royal palace is a hub. The Palace of Nyani was not a single towering building, but a sprawling compound of courtyards, halls, and chambers. Its mud brick walls enclosed spaces for administration, audience, and ceremony. The gates, reinforced with heavy timber, opened into wide courtyards where guards stood watch and petitioners gathered. Inside, the rhythm of governance unfolded. Officials moved between chambers, carrying documents, recording tribute, and consulting with scribes. Courtiers waited in shaded walkways, hopping for a word with the Mansa. Messengers arrived with reports from provinces, their journeys marked by dust and fatigue. The palace was alive with quiet labor, not dazzling but steady, sustaining the empire's reach. The Mansa's court. At the center of this machinery stood the Mansa himself. He was more than a ruler. He was a figure of authority, wealth, and ritual. Audiences with the Mansa were carefully staged. Petitioners bowed deeply, griots recited genealogies, and attendants displayed symbols of wealth, gold ornaments, fine cloth, or even slabs of salt. Mansa Musa, remembered as one of the greatest of Mali's rulers, listened carefully to reports, asked questions, and issued judgments. His power was immense, but it was exercised through ritual as much as command. To speak in his court was to participate in a performance of authority, where every gesture reinforced hierarchy. Officials and scribes. The empire's administration depended on a network of officials. Governors managed provinces, reporting to the palace. Tax collectors ensured that tribute grain, cattle, gold, salt flowed to the capital. Judges, often trained scholars, resolved disputes in line with Islamic law. Scribes recorded these activities, writing in Arabic on imported paper. Their work was tedious but vital: lists of tribute, agreements between provinces, letters to foreign rulers. In the palace archives, such documents accumulated, each one a fragment of governance. The scribe's labor gave permanence to decisions, transforming spoken orders into written records. Tribute and storage. Tribute was the lifeblood of the empire. Each year, provinces sent goods to Nyani: bags of grain, herds of cattle, slaves, and precious metals. Caravans of donkeys and oxen entered the city, their loads carried into palace storerooms. These storerooms, simple but vast, held supplies for the court, the army, and the city itself. Salt was stacked in slabs, grain poured into silos, gold stored in guarded chambers. Nothing glittered in displays. Wealth was practical, meant to sustain governance. Yet its accumulation in Nyani gave the palace strength. Tribute was not just economic, it was political. Each delivery affirmed loyalty to the Mansa. Each absence signaled rebellion or neglect. Justice and authority. In Nyani, justice was also administered. Disputes from across the empire sometimes reached the capital: arguments over inheritance, conflicts between merchants, or grievances against officials. Judges listened, consulted law, and issued rulings. But justice was not only formal. The presence of the Mansa himself was a symbol of order. His ability to summon governors, to punish disobedience, to reward loyalty, all reinforced the sense that authority flowed from Nyani. The city's role was not only administrative but symbolic. It embodied the idea of empire itself. The invisible labor. Behind this machinery lay countless invisible workers. Servants carried water into the palace, prepared food for the court, and tended to animals in the royal stables. Guards stood watch at gates, their presence reminding all of the Mansa's power. Slaves labored in storerooms, moving heavy loads of grain and salt. These lives rarely entered chronicles, but without them the machinery of governance could not function. The smooth operation of the palace depended on hands that cleaned, carried, cooked, and guarded. Authority may have appeared grand in audience halls, but it rested on quiet, unrecorded labor. The flow of information. Information was as important as tribute. Messengers carried news of battles, famines, or trade disputes from the farthest provinces to Naini. Their journeys were long, sometimes taking weeks or months. They traveled by river on horseback or on foot, their words memorized or written on parchment. When they arrived, their reports shaped decisions. The Mansa responded with orders, sending grain to a famine-struck province, dispatching soldiers to secure a trade route, or adjusting taxes in response to drought. In this way, Naini functioned as the empire's nervous system, receiving signals and sending commands. Rituals of power. Governance in Naini was never purely administrative. Ritual gave authority its form. Griots recited the history of the Mansa's lineage, reminding all of his rightful claim to rule. Musicians played in audiences, their instruments echoing the power of tradition. Ceremonies marked festivals, harvests, or military victories, reinforcing the connection between ruler and people. These rituals blended with governance, making administration not only practical but symbolic. To witness them was to be reminded that authority in Mali was both earthly and sacred, rooted in tradition as much as law. A question of fragility. Yet behind the order of Naini lay fragility. The machinery of governance depended on tribute, on the loyalty of officials, on the flow of information across vast distances. A drought, a rebellion, or corruption could disrupt the system. The palace, though strong in ritual, was vulnerable in practice. This fragility raises a question. How long could such a system endure, built on the rhythm of tribute, the labor of invisible workers, and the authority of a single man? The Palace of Naini turned the rhythms of tribute and labor into the governance of empire. Yet no empire survives on administration alone. How did ordinary people of the capital live within this machinery? How did families, children, and neighborhoods find meaning in the shadow of palaces and markets? The Palace of Naini represented the empire's authority, but the city itself was sustained by its people. Behind the courtyards of kings and the halls of officials lay the lives of families, neighbors, and workers who made the capital breathe. Their routines, though rarely recorded in chronicles, shaped the city more deeply than any decree. The family compound. Most residents of Naini lived in family compounds. A compound was a small world, an enclosed space with mud brick houses, a courtyard, and silos for grain. Within its walls, daily life unfolded in patterns of work, rest, and ritual. Women rose early to grind millet, their wooden pestles striking rhythmically in mortars, the sound carrying across neighborhoods like a morning drumbeat. They prepared meals, fetched water from wells, and managed household trade. Men tended small fields or workshops, returning in the evening with goods or food. Children played in the dust, imitating adults work in their games, learning skills by watching rather than formal teaching. The compound was more than a residence, it was a community of kin. Grandparents told stories to children, cousins grew up as siblings, and responsibilities were shared. Food was prepared in common pots, meals eaten together. This intimacy bound families into units strong enough to endure hardship. Work and craft. Beyond farming, Naini depended on crafts. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons, their forges glowing in small workshops. Their work carried a special status, for iron was seen as both useful and mysterious. Potters shaped clay into cooking vessels, storage jars, and decorative items, their hands moving with practiced ease. Weavers produced cloth, some plain for everyday use, others fine enough to be worn by nobles. Markets gave craftsmen a place to sell their goods, but much of their work remained within families or exchanged as barter. A pot might be traded for grain, a piece of cloth for firewood. The economy of Naini was both formal and informal, a mixture of coin, barter, and obligation. Children and education. For children, Education began at home but often extended to community learning. Boys might be apprenticed to craftsmen or trained to assist in farming. Girls learned weaving, cooking, and household management. But education also meant memorization of stories, songs, and genealogies. Some children studied in Quranic schools, learning to recite the Quran, to read and write Arabic, and to practice prayers. They sat on mats, repeating verses aloud, their voices rising in unison. These schools were modest, yet they provided the foundation for Mali's intellectual traditions, linking the youngest generation to the scholars of Timbuktu and beyond. Food and meals. Meals in Niani were simple but sustaining. Millet porridge was common, flavored with sauce made from vegetables, beans, or fish from the Niger. Salt, precious in the empire, was used sparingly to season food. Meat was eaten on special occasions, often during festivals or when guests arrived. Meals were eaten communally, with family members gathered around a shared bowl. Eating was not only nourishment but ritual, reinforcing unity. Guests were welcomed with food, for hospitality was a measure of status and virtue. Music and storytelling. Life in Niani was filled with sound. Drums beat during festivals, flutes and stringed instruments accompanied gatherings, and griots recited histories in long, melodic verses. Music was not entertainment alone, it was memory, teaching, and ceremony. Griots held a unique role, preserving the genealogies of kings and nobles, recounting the victories and failures of rulers. Their performances reminded the city of its past, binding present lives to ancestral traditions. In family compounds, smaller stories were told at night by elders, passing down lessons of survival, morality, and resilience. Women and authority. Women in Niani carried more authority than chronicles often admit. They controlled markets, managing trade in food and household goods. They managed households, deciding how to allocate food and labor. Some served as advisors within families of power, their counsel shaping decisions behind palace walls. Though men dominated formal politics, women's influence permeated daily life. Their control of markets gave them economic leverage, and their central role in family compounds made them indispensable to the city's stability. Nightlife in the capital. When darkness fell, the capital quieted, but not entirely. Families gathered around small fires, sharing food and stories. Musicians sometimes played in courtyards, their instruments echoing softly through the night. Griots visited compounds, offering songs in exchange for gifts. The palace remained a place of activity, with guards patrolling and officials working by lamplight. Decisions of empire were sometimes made in the cool hours after sunset, when the air was easier to bear. But outside the palace walls, most of Niani slept, its silence broken only by dogs barking or donkeys braying. Fragility and continuity. Life in Niani was steady, but it was not immune to hardship. Drought strained food supplies, diseases swept through households, and political conflicts disrupted trade. Families relied on resilience, storing grain when they could, turning to kin for support, and finding comfort in ritual and tradition. This resilience made the capital endure. Palaces might rise and fall, rulers might succeed one another, but the compounds of families continued. The city's true strength was not only in governance but in the quiet routines of households. A reflection on the capital. To walk through Niani was not to see grandeur but to feel rhythm. The pounding of grain, the calls of traders, the prayers of worshippers, the songs of griots all blended into the sound of a city alive. Its walls of mud were fragile, but its routines were strong. Its palaces might crumble, but its families endured. The daily life of Niani was not written in monuments, but in meals, markets, and music. Its people carried the empire as surely as its rulers did. And so one must ask, when we think of a capital, should we measure its greatness by the palaces of kings, or by the rhythms of ordinary families whose lives gave the city its breath. Story 6. The Niger River, lifeblood of the empire. If the Mali Empire was a body, the Niger River was its bloodstream. Gold and salt may have filled the empire's treasury, kings may have commanded armies, but without the river daily life would have faltered. Flowing in a great curve across West Africa, the Niger nourished fields, carried boats, and sustained the rhythm of survival. Unlike the deserts to the north or the forests to the south, the Niger Valley offered balance: water for crops, pastures for animals, and routes for travel. It was here, along its banks, that towns and villages flourished, and it was here that the empire anchored its strength. Geography of a curve. The Niger is no straight river. It arcs across the land in a great crescent, flowing northeast before bending southeast. In Mali's heartland, it spreads into a vast inland delta, a maze of channels, swamps, and floodplains. This delta was both challenge and blessing. During floods, water covered fields, replenishing soil but forcing families to move. During dry seasons, the receding waters left fertile land for planting. This rhythm shaped agriculture. Farmers planted rice in the lowlands, millet and sorghum on higher ground. Fishermen cast nets into channels, pulling up catches of catfish and tilapia. Herds grazed on grasses that grew after floods receded. The river's cycle demanded patience, but it offered abundance. Villages and towns. Along the Niger, villages clustered near fields and fishing spots. Houses were built of mud brick, arranged in compounds, shaded by trees. Each village depended on the river's gifts: water for wells, fish for food, fertile soil for crops. Larger towns grew at crossing points and fertile stretches. Timbuktu, Gao, and Niani all owed part of their prosperity to their nearness to the river. Boats carried goods between them, their movement slower than caravans but steadier, free from the dangers of the desert. The river was not only a path for trade but a thread of community. Families visited relatives across the water, festivals were held along its banks, and rituals honored its presence. Boats and travel. Boats on the Niger were simple but effective. Made from hollowed logs or planks bound together, they carried fishermen, merchants, and passengers. Some boats were small, guided by a single oar. Others were large enough to carry cargo, grain, salt, or people across long distances. Travel by river was not without risk. Currents shifted, sandbanks blocked passage, and crocodiles lurked in the shallows. Yet compared to the vastness of the desert, the Niger offered a safer, more predictable route. Goods moved steadily along its waters, tying together distant towns with a watery thread. Rituals of water. The Niger was more than a resource, it was a presence. Communities saw it as a living force, offering both life and danger. Rituals acknowledged its power: prayers before fishing, offerings before planting, songs sung to its waters. Even with the spread of Islam, older traditions lingered. Families poured libations at the river's edge, asking for safe journeys or bountiful harvests. Children learned early to respect its currents, warned not only of drowning but of spirits said to dwell within. A cycle of patience. The river taught patience. Floods could destroy houses, but they also renewed fields. Droughts could shrink channels, but they also concentrated fish. Families adapted, moving when necessary, rebuilding after each season. This cycle, though demanding, provided stability across generations. The Niger did not dazzle like gold. It did not glitter like salt. Its value lay in repetition, in the slow rhythm of water rising and falling, sustaining life without spectacle. The Niger's course shaped villages, towns, and fields, binding together the empire's daily life. But how did the river also serve as a path for trade and governance? How did its waters carry not only fish and farmers, but also the empire's wealth and authority? The Niger River was not only a source of food and fertile soil, it was also a road. Its waters carried merchants, officials, and messages, linking the towns of the Mali Empire in a way no desert path could match. If caravans bound Mali to the wider world, the river bound the empire to itself. Boats as caravans of water. The boats that moved along the Niger were humble, yet they carried the empire's lifeblood. Long dugouts, carved from tree trunks, glided over calm stretches. Larger vessels, pieced together from planks, carried bulkier loads. Traders piled them with grain, firewood, or clay pots. Slabs of salt, carried from the desert, were sometimes floated downstream after reaching river towns, easing the burden of land travel. Boatmen worked with patience, guiding their vessels by poles, paddles, or sails of woven cloth. They knew the river's bends and sandbanks, steering carefully to avoid grounding. Their chants echoed across the water as they rowed, turning the river into a highway of voices and movement. Market towns along the banks. Towns along the Niger grew rich from its traffic. Markets opened at river crossings, where boats arrived with goods from upstream and downstream. Gao, one of Mali's major cities, owed its prosperity in part to this trade. Fishermen sold their catch fresh from the water, while traders displayed salt, cloth, and imported goods. Farmers brought millet and rice from nearby fields. These markets were not only economic centers but cultural meeting points. News spread along the river as easily as goods. A traveler from the north might bring stories of distant markets. A scholar from Timbuktu might carry a manuscript downstream to a smaller town. The river, in this way, carried ideas as much as commodities. Administration on the water. The empire's officials recognized the Niger's importance. Just as caravans were taxed, so too were boats. Officials stationed in river towns collected fees, inspected goods, and ensured that tribute moved smoothly toward the capital. Grain from provincial fields, fish from river communities, and salt from northern caravans all flowed into palace storerooms through the Niger's channels. Soldiers sometimes patrolled the riverbanks, both to secure trade and to assert authority. Their presence was a reminder that the river was not only a natural resource but a political artery, claimed by the Mansa as part of his domain. Communication across distances. Messages moved along the Niger with greater speed than over land. A boat carrying a letter from Timbuktu to Niamey could travel faster than a messenger on foot or horseback. Officials relied on this waterway to send reports of tribute, conflicts, or natural disasters. The river, in this sense, was the empire's voice, allowing orders and news to travel across vast distances. This communication was fragile, however. A boat could capsize in a storm, or a message might be delayed by shallow waters. Still, compared to the desert routes, the river offered greater certainty. Its steady flow gave the empire a measure of cohesion. Ritual and authority. The Niger's role in governance was not only practical, it was also symbolic. To control the river was to control life itself. Rulers emphasized their guardianship of its waters, framing themselves as protectors of fertility and abundance. Ceremonies sometimes acknowledged this connection, with offerings made to ensure steady floods or safe journeys. In audiences, tribute delivered by boat was displayed alongside that carried by caravan, reminding all that the empire's wealth came from both desert and river. The Niger, though silent and unadorned, was as much a part of royal authority as gold. Fragility of dependence. Yet reliance on the Niger brought vulnerability. Droughts could shrink its waters, disrupting trade and straining harvests. Floods could destroy fields and houses, scattering families. Bandits sometimes ambushed boats, seizing goods from merchants. These disruptions revealed the limits of imperial control. The river gave life, but it also demanded respect and adaptation. The empire's strength lay not in conquering the river but in enduring its cycles. Families rebuilt after floods, adjusted planting seasons, and stored grain for lean years. Officials redirected trade when channels dried. The empire endured by bending with the river's rhythms, not by defying them. A question of power. The Niger River tied Mali together, carrying goods, people, and authority. But in binding the empire so closely to its waters, it also raised a question. Could a kingdom built on a river's cycles truly remain stable, or was it always vulnerable to the whims of nature? The river served as Mali's highway, carrying trade and authority alike. But its greatest gift was not power or wealth, it was sustenance. How did families live from the river itself, feeding their households with its fish, farming its fertile banks, and weaving it into their everyday survival? The Niger River was more than a trade route or symbol of authority. For the people who lived along its banks, it was woven into the fabric of survival. To wake in a village near the Niger was to live by its rhythm, to measure the year not by calendars but by the rise and fall of its waters. Fishing and food. Fishing was one of the most constant labors of the river. Men set out in narrow boats, their nets stretched wide, their movements practiced from childhood. They cast lines for catfish, tilapia, and perch, and sometimes trapped smaller fish in woven baskets set in shallow channels. Fishing was not only work but a way of life. Songs accompanied the casting of nets, chants kept rhythm for paddlers, and stories of river spirits were told to children as warnings and lessons. The catch fed families directly, but it also supplied markets. Dried or smoked fish traveled by caravan to towns far from the river, carrying with them the taste of the Niger. Farming the floodplain. Each year, the river's floods brought both danger and renewal. When the waters rose, families moved to higher ground, carrying belongings on donkeys or balancing bundles on their heads. Houses were sometimes left behind, to be repaired or rebuilt once waters receded. When the floods retreated, they left behind soil rich with silt. Farmers planted rice in the lowlands, sowed millet and sorghum on drier ground, and grew vegetables in garden plots. The work was demanding, timed precisely to the river's cycle, but it sustained households with food and trade goods. The floodplain was both generous and unpredictable. A late flood could delay planting, a weak one could leave fields dry. Families adapted as best they could, storing surplus grain, diversifying crops, and relying on kin networks during lean years. Herding and pastures. The Niger's floodplains were not only fields but also pastures. When waters receded, grasses grew thick and green, drawing herders with their cattle, goats, and sheep. Herds grazed freely, their bells clanging softly as they moved. This seasonal migration shaped the lives of herders, who followed the river's rhythms as closely as farmers did. Conflicts sometimes arose when herds trampled fields, but arrangements were usually made, recognizing that both farming and herding depended on the same cycles of water. Domestic life by the river. For families, the river was part of daily routine. Women fetched water in clay jars, balancing them carefully on their heads as they returned to compounds. Children learned to swim in shallow stretches, though always with caution, for the river's current was strong and crocodiles were never far. Laundry was washed at the banks, with cloth spread on grasses to dry. Clay for pottery was gathered from riverbeds. Even leisure often centered on the river. Young people gathered at its edge to talk, fish casually, or watch boats pass. Stories and spirits. The Niger was alive not only in work but in imagination. Families told stories of spirits dwelling in its depths, of crocodiles that were more than animals, of waters that could bless or punish. Offerings of millet or small sacrifices were sometimes left at its banks, even among those who practiced Islam. These beliefs gave the river a presence that went beyond utility. It was not only a place to fish or farm, it was a being to respect, a force larger than any single village. Children were taught to approach it with care, never forgetting that life and death mingled in its currents. The river at night. When the sun set, the Niger did not grow silent. Crickets and frogs filled the air with sound, crocodiles slipped into shallows, and fishermen sometimes worked by lamplight. Families gathered near its banks during festivals, lighting fires that flickered on the water. The river reflected stars as if holding the night sky in its surface. In this darkness, the Niger became both vast and intimate, a reminder of the cycles of nature that shaped every household, every meal, every life. Continuity and chain. Generations passed, but the rhythms of the Niger remained steady. Families fished as their ancestors had, planted according to floods and told stories that mixed memory with myth. Empires rose and fell, rulers passed through palaces, but the river endured. This continuity was Mali's true strength. While rulers claimed authority over gold and salt, it was the Niger that gave ordinary people their survival. The empire rested not only on tribute and trade, but on the daily work of families who lived with the river's cycles. A reflection on wealth. The Niger teaches a quieter lesson about wealth. Gold glittered, salt sustained trade, but water, fish, and fertile soil were the treasures that made life possible. The empire's grandeur might be measured in caravans and palaces, but its endurance depended on families fishing at dawn, farmers planting after floods, and children fetching water in clay jars.